Okay, get ready to explore the complex and often hidden world of
Yeah,
money laundering.
definitely a world of smoke and mirrors.
You've sent us some seriously interesting sources on this,
Oh, yeah, this is some good stuff.
including a deep dive on that wild case in Singapore.
Yeah, the Singapore case is a wild one.
Billions of dollars, luxury properties, a daring escape attempt. Sounds like something straight out of a movie.
Yeah, it's got all the makings of a Hollywood blockbuster for sure. But what's fascinating about this topic is how it touches on so many aspects of our lives. Finance, art, real estate, even international relations.
It really does.
And while we're uncovering the shady side of things, remember,
Mm-hmm.
understanding how money laundering works is the first step to protecting yourself.
It's like they say knowledge is power. So before we get into luxury apartments and art auctions, let's start with the basics. What exactly is money laundering?
Well, in the simplest terms, money laundering is disguising illegally obtained money to make it appear legitimate.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Imagine a kid who finds a wallet with a wad of cash.
Uh-huh.
They might be tempted to splurge,
Yeah.
but how are they going to explain that to their parents? They'll need a cover story, a way to rationalize their sudden wealth. Money laundering is essentially that, but on a much larger scale, creating narratives to make ill-gotten gains seem legitimate.
Okay, that makes sense, but why bother? If someone's sitting on a pile of cash, why not just spend it?
That's where the motivation comes in. If we're talking about a few $100s, sure, you might be able to get away with it.
Right.
But imagine trying to buy something like a sports car with a suitcase full of cash. It raises eyebrows, people start asking questions,
For sure.
and those questions could lead straight back to the original crime.
So it's about covering your tracks.
Precisely. Criminals have two main goals when it comes to money laundering. First, they need to make the money difficult to trace to avoid getting caught. That's where techniques like layering come in, which we'll discuss later.
Mm.
The second goal is to make the money appear legitimate to justify their lavish spending without raising red flags. They need a believable story, a way to explain where all that wealth came from.
Right, because a sudden influx of cash is bound to attract attention, especially if it doesn't match your typical income. You need a good story to explain it. Speaking of stories, you mentioned something about little rascals in your notes that I thought was interesting.
Yes, it's a great analogy to understand the motivation behind money laundering. Remember the episode where Alfalfa finds a wallet full of money and tries to hide his spending from his parents?
Yeah, vaguely, yeah.
That's essentially what criminals are doing, just on a much larger scale.
Okay, I like that. So we've got the why covered. What about the how? What are some of the techniques criminals actually use to launder money? I'm guessing it's a bit more complicated than just stuffing cash under a mattress.
You're absolutely right. There are countless methods, each with varying levels of complexity, but some classic techniques involve businesses that naturally handle a lot of cash.
Okay.
Think restaurants, laundromats, or even casinos. These businesses provide a convenient way to mix dirty money with legitimate income, making it difficult to separate the two.
Wait, so even something as ordinary as doing laundry could be used for money laundering?
Believe it or not, yes. The term money laundering itself is believed to originate from criminals using laundromats as a front to clean their illegal profits. They'd mix their dirty money with the cash from legitimate customers, making it nearly impossible to trace. And since these businesses often deal with small denominations of cash, it was even harder to detect.
Wow, who knew there was such a dark side to freshly laundered socks?
Hmm.
But this method has its limits, right?
You're right. While this tactic might work for smaller amounts, it becomes increasingly difficult to launder large sums of money through a single business without raising suspicion. The scale of the operation needs to match the amount of money being laundered. Plus, owning these businesses directly carries risks, so criminals started using proxies or shell companies to create distance between themselves and the dirty money.
Shell companies, we did a deep dive on those a while back,
They
right?
did. Shell companies are essentially businesses that exist only on paper. No real operations or employees.
Right.
They're often registered in jurisdictions with strict secrecy laws, making them ideal for hiding assets and obscuring ownership.
Ah, right, like those tropical islands with more palm trees than people.
Yeah.
But you're saying these shell companies are a key part of the money laundering process.
Absolutely. They act like masks, hiding the true identities of the criminals behind the financial transactions. Imagine a criminal organization wanting to launder their illegal profits. They might deposit a large sum of cash into a shell company's bank account in a country with lax financial regulations. Then, using that deposit as collateral, they take out a loan from a bank in another country under the name of another shell company, Finally, they transfer that loan to yet another shell company that they control, registered in yet another location.
Wow, it's like a financial shell game.
Yeah.
By the time authorities unravel that web of transactions, the money has vanished.
Exactly. And because these transactions often cross international borders, it becomes even more difficult to track and prosecute.
Yeah, of course.
Each jurisdiction has its own laws and regulations, making international cooperation essential but often challenging.
So it sounds like criminals are exploiting the complexity of the global financial system to their advantage. But it's not just about moving money around, is it? They also need to make it look like it came from legitimate sources.
Precisely. And that's where things get really interesting. They have to get creative and find ways to inject that dirty money into the legal economy.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of money laundering and the role of shell companies. But what are some other ways criminals try to legitimize their ill-gotten gains? You mentioned art heists earlier. Are we talking stolen masterpieces?
While art heists do happen, it's not always about replacing a masterpiece with a copy, like in the movies.
Hmm.
Criminals are drawn to the art world for a couple of reasons. First, art is often seen as a luxury good with a subjective value. One person's trash is another person's million-dollar masterpiece, right? This makes it easier to inflate prices and justify large transactions. Second, the art market often relies on discretion buyers, and sellers might not want their identities revealed,
Yeah.
which plays right into the hands of someone trying to hide their tracks.
So a criminal could buy a piece of art for a relatively low price, then have it appraised for a much higher value, and sell it to, say, one of their shell companies.
You've got it. It's a classic case of creating artificial profits on paper to justify the movement of large sums of money. And because the buyer is often one of their own companies, they haven't actually lost any money. They've simply moved it from one pocket to another, giving it a veneer of legitimacy in the process.
It's almost like they're creating their own little financial ecosystem with these shell companies acting as different players in the game.
That's a great way to think about it. And it's not just art either. Remember those 207 properties in Singapore we mentioned? Real estate is another favorite among criminals looking to launder money.
Oh yeah, the Singapore case, we promised to circle back to that. 207 properties, that's not exactly subtle, is it?
Yeah.
What makes real estate so appealing to these criminals?
Think about it. Real estate is a tangible asset. It's a place you can live, you can rent it out, and it tends to appreciate in value over time. It's a great way for criminals to park their money while it's being cleaned and even generate some legal income on the side.
Plus, owning real estate gives you a sense of legitimacy, right? Like, oh, they must be doing something right if they can afford all this property.
Exactly. It creates a perception of wealth that can be hard to refute, even if the origins of that wealth are, shall we say, a little murky. And in some cases, criminals are even willing to pay above market value for properties, which can drive up prices and create a sense of urgency in the market.
It's like they're playing Monopoly in the real world, but with much higher stakes. So we've got art, we've got real estate. What other assets are commonly used in money laundering schemes?
Well, besides those, there's gold, which is highly portable, easy to transport across borders, and universally recognized as a valuable asset. Take, for example, this Moroccan gold laundering ring that was recently busted. They used a network of seemingly unconnected individuals, like an airport janitor and a paramedic, to move cash across borders. Then they'd use that cash to buy gold, which was then smuggled out of the country.
Wait, they actually used an airport janitor? How do they even...
It's fascinating, isn't it? They had a whole system worked out. The janitor would receive cash-filled packages from other members of the ring, often disguised as ordinary items. He'd then pass them off to a seemingly unconnected individual, like a traveler heading to Dubai. Once the gold was purchased, it was often smuggled out of the country using creative methods, even hidden within the lining of luggage.
It sounds like something straight out of a spy movie.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing Dubai was a strategic choice.
Absolutely. Dubai is a global hub for gold trading, which makes it much easier to blend illegally sourced gold with legitimate supplies. From there, it can be melted down, recast, and reintroduced into the global market, with its origins effectively erased. It's a classic example of how criminals exploit global trade networks to their advantage.
So it's not just about hiding the money itself, but also about obscuring its origins and making it untraceable.
You've got it. And it's not just gold. Money launderers also utilize other assets, such as luxury goods, diamonds, and even digital assets like NFTs.
NFTs, really? So even the metaverse isn't safe from this stuff.
Unfortunately not. Criminals are always adapting and looking for new ways to exploit loopholes in the system. And with the rise of digital currencies and online transactions, there are even more opportunities for them to move money undetected.
It's like a never-ending game of cat and mouse between criminals and authorities.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, how do investigators even begin to unravel these complex money laundering schemes? It seems like finding a needle in a haystack.
You're absolutely right. It often starts with a tiny detail, a discrepancy that seems insignificant at first, but then unravels the entire operation. Remember that Moroccan gold laundering ring we mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
Their downfall came from a seemingly unrelated audit. An auditor at a Dubai jewelry company noticed a suspicious amount of cash transactions, which eventually led investigators back to the Moroccan gang.
So it often comes down to someone, somewhere, noticing something that's just a little bit off.
Precisely. And that's why international cooperation and information sharing are crucial in combating money laundering. It's a global problem that requires a global solution.
Makes sense. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, you mentioned earlier that criminals also have to make their illegal income seem legitimate. We've talked about art and real estate, but what are some other ways they try to rationalize their wealth?
Well, one common tactic is to create businesses. Not necessarily successful or even legitimate ones, just businesses that generate a lot of cash flow. They don't actually care about the long-term success of these ventures. They're just using them as a front to launder their dirty money.
So like a restaurant that always seems empty but somehow stays afloat.
Exactly. They might even inflate their reported income to justify larger deposits.
Oh, wow.
Or take the example of a film production company.
Okay.
Creating a movie involves numerous expenses, from set design and special effects to actor salaries and marketing costs.
And I bet those explosions aren't cheap either.
You've got that right. And that's where the opportunity for creative accounting comes in. They can easily inflate invoices or invent expenses that are difficult to verify, especially when you're dealing with something as subjective as the cost of special effects or set design.
So it's a way to inject dirty money into the system under the guise of legitimate business expenses. Clever, but shady. What about the sports world? You had something in your notes about a Russian businessman and a football club.
Ah, yes. This is a fascinating case that illustrates how criminals exploit the world of professional sports for money laundering. In this instance, a Russian businessman bought a struggling Portuguese football club. On the surface, it seemed like a typical acquisition, but investigators soon realized something was amiss.
What tipped him off?
Well, for starters, the new owner was living a lavish lifestyle that didn't quite align with the financial status of a nearly bankrupt football club. But the real red flag was a series of questionable player transfers, highly priced acquisitions of players who were then mysteriously benched.
Wait, so they were buying expensive players but not even playing them? That sounds more like money laundering than team management.
Exactly. It was a classic case of using a legitimate business, in this case, a football club, to mask the movement of illegal funds. This case highlights how industries with complex financial structures and a high degree of secrecy, like professional sports, can be particularly vulnerable to exploitation by money launderers.
And it's not just football clubs, is it? I imagine we see similar things in other sports with big money flowing around.
Absolutely. We've seen similar tactics used across various sports, often exploiting the complexities of player contracts, image rights, and sponsorship deals. But money laundering isn't always about high-profile figures and complex schemes. Sometimes it targets everyday people like you and me.
You mean like that slow charging thing you mentioned earlier? It almost sounded too good to be true.
And in the world of money laundering, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Right.
Slow charging is a sneaky tactic where criminals trick unsuspecting individuals into unknowingly becoming part of their operation.
Okay. I'm all ears. How does that work?
Let's say you're a gamer and you come across a website offering discounted game credits. You pay $80 for $100 worth of credits. Seems like steal.
I've definitely been tempted by those kinds of deals before.
It's a common tactic because it plays on our desire to save money. But here's the catch. That website is likely controlled by or connected to money launderers.
Okay.
They take your $80 and combine it with, say, $20 of their dirty money, maybe from an online scam.
Right.
Then they use a network of accounts to move that money around, making it harder to trace. Finally, they release the full $100 in game credits to you, successfully cleaning that $20 of dirty money in the process.
So they're using my legitimate transaction as a cover for their illegal activities.
Hmm.
And because the money is moving through multiple accounts, it creates that layering effect we talked about earlier, making it harder to trace.
Exactly. And because this process often involves delays with excuses like server issues or processing times, it's called slow charging.
Hi.
They're buying time while they launder the money.
That's a little unnerving, to be honest. What are some red flags people should watch out for?
Unusually long processing times for online transactions are a big one. If it's taking days or even weeks for a simple purchase or top-up to go through, that's a sign that something fishy might be going on. Also, be wary of websites offering deals that seem too good to be true, especially if they involve unusual currencies or payment methods.
Good advice. It seems like with all these different techniques, it must be really hard for authorities to stay ahead of the curve. How do they even begin to tackle this?
You're right, it's a constant challenge. Criminals are always adapting and finding new ways to exploit weaknesses in the system, but law enforcement agencies are also stepping up their game using data analysis, artificial intelligence, and international cooperation to try to identify suspicious activity and track down the perpetrators.
So it's a technological arms race with both sides trying to outsmart the other. What about on a more individual level, though? What's one of the most effective tools in combating money laundering?
One of the most effective tools is something we touched on earlier, know your customer, or KYC.
Right. KYC. That's where banks and financial institutions have to verify the identities of their clients and understand the nature of the transactions.
Precisely. It's about being vigilant and asking questions. Where is this money coming from? Who is the ultimate beneficiary? What is the purpose of this transaction?
Right.
These might seem like basic questions, but they're crucial in identifying suspicious activity and preventing money laundering.
It's like being a financial detective, looking for clues that might reveal a larger criminal enterprise.
Exactly. And it's not just about catching the criminals after the fact. It's about preventing these crimes from happening in the first place by making it more difficult for them to move and conceal their money.
Right. Prevention is key.
Yeah.
But there must be a gray area when it comes to KYC. How much digging is too much digging? Where's the line between protecting privacy and preventing financial crime?
That's a valid point. It's a delicate balance. And unfortunately, some individuals and institutions might exploit those gray areas for their own gain.
Like in that case with a Russian broker in Deutsche Bank.
Yeah.
Right. They were using mirror trading to help wealthy Russians move their money out of the country undetected.
Exactly. It was a complex scheme, but to put it simply, they used simultaneous stock trades in different markets.
Right.
On the surface, it looked like legitimate investment activity, when in reality, they were just converting rubles into dollars and moving them out of reach of Russian authorities.
And Deutsche Bank got slapped with some hefty fines for its role in that, right?
They did. It highlighted the importance of strong internal controls and a culture of compliance within financial institutions. However, KYC isn't foolproof. Criminals often use sophisticated methods to circumvent these checks, and there's always the risk of human error, or in some cases, intentional negligence within institutions.
It's a reminder that this is a complex issue, and everyone has a role to play in combating financial crime, from individuals being aware of the tactics used to institutions implementing strong KYC procedures.
Speaking of institutions, we talked about the role of shell companies earlier. Those seem like they'd be a prime target for money launderers, given their anonymity.
You're absolutely right. Shell companies, especially those registered in jurisdictions with lax regulations or high levels of secrecy, can be incredibly difficult to penetrate.
Right.
However, there are efforts underway to address this. One major development has been the push for greater transparency in company ownership. Many countries are now requiring companies to disclose their beneficial owners, the real people who ultimately control or profit from the company, even if their names don't appear on any official documents.
So it's about piercing that veil of secrecy and exposing the puppet masters behind the scenes.
Exactly. By creating public registers of beneficial ownership, it makes it much harder for criminals to hide their assets and move money through a labyrinth of shell companies. That makes sense. It sounds like a massive undertaking, though, trying to get all these different countries on the same page.
It is, but it's essential. Money laundering is a global problem that requires a global solution. While there's still a long way to go, the good news is that there's growing awareness of the issue and increasing cooperation among nations to address it.
Well, that's somewhat reassuring. We've covered a lot of ground here. The basics of money laundering, the techniques criminals use, the role of shell companies, KYC, and international cooperation.
Yep.
But we still haven't circled back to that crazy Singapore case. What happened after the authorities uncovered the operation?
Right, the Singapore case. Well, after that initial discovery of the forged document, the investigation snowballed, eventually leading to the arrest of 10 individuals and the seizure of over $1 billion in assets.
$1 billion. That's a drop in the bucket compared to the trillions laundered globally each year. But it's still a significant victory. What were some of the key takeaways from that case?
One major takeaway was the relative simplicity of the method used. These weren't criminal masterminds using cutting-edge technology. They were relying on forged documents and a network of shell companies. It highlights the importance of vigilance and due diligence even in seemingly straightforward transactions.
So even seemingly small details can unravel a massive criminal operation. What about the individuals involved? What happened to them?
Those who were apprehended faced serious consequences, including prison sentences and the seizure of their assets. But the case also had ripple effects beyond those directly involved.
How so?
Well, it led to increased scrutiny of Singapore's financial system and its regulations on money laundering.
Okay.
The government implemented stricter rules, particularly around real estate transactions and the activities of family offices, those private companies that manage the wealth of ultra-high net worth individuals.
So it forced Singapore to tighten up its act and close some of those loopholes criminals were exploiting. Did that solve the problem, though?
It's like a game of whack-a-mole. You press down on one area and another one pops up somewhere else. In this case, we saw a shift in activity from Singapore to Hong Kong. With stricter regulations in Singapore, some wealthy individuals and family offices started moving their assets and operations to Hong Kong, which was perceived as having a more favorable regulatory environment at the time.
It really is a constant game of cat and mouse, isn't it? Criminals, governments, and financial institutions are all trying to outmaneuver each other.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights the complexities of combating financial crime in a globalized world. It's a never-ending challenge that requires constant vigilance, adaptation, and cooperation.
While we focused on more formalized systems, it's important to remember that money laundering often thrives in the shadows as well. Speaking of which, remember that intriguing case in Singapore we touched on earlier. Besides highlighting the global nature of this issue, it also showed that even seemingly simple methods, like using forged documents, can be incredibly effective.
You're right. That case really underscored how important it is to be aware of these tactics. Knowledge is power, and the more we understand about how money laundering works, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves.
So we've explored this shady world of money laundering, and I have to admit, it can feel a bit overwhelming. Knowing what we do now, what can we do to avoid getting caught up in these schemes?
You're right. It's a vast and complex issue. But there are steps we can take to protect ourselves. One of the most important things is to be aware of the tactics we've discussed. Remember, if a deal seems too good to be true, it probably is, especially if it involves things like long processing times or unusual payment methods. Trust your instincts and do your research.
That's a good point. What else can we do on a more individual level?
Protecting your personal information is crucial. Guard your identity, your financial details, and your account information closely. Be wary of phishing attempts, shred those financial documents, and think twice before sharing sensitive information online, especially on sites you're not familiar with.
It's all about being proactive. But what if, despite our best efforts, we find ourselves in a situation where we suspect money laundering might be happening? What should we do?
In that case, it's crucial to report your suspicions to the appropriate authorities.
Okay, so who do we contact?
It varies depending on your location. Generally, you can start by contacting your local police department or financial regulator. Many countries also have dedicated financial intelligence units, often called FIUs, that are specifically tasked with investigating financial crimes like money laundering.
FIU's got it.
Yeah.
I'm guessing they probably have websites with reporting procedures and contact information.
Most likely, yes. And even if you're not completely certain that what you're seeing constitutes illegal activity, it's always better to err on the side of caution and report it. It's better for the authorities to investigate a false alarm than to miss a chance to uncover a larger operation.
That makes sense. See something, say something, right?
Exactly. Awareness, vigilance, and proactive action are our strongest defenses in this complex and constantly evolving world of financial crime.
Well said. We've explored the underbelly of money laundering, uncovered its intricate methods, and hopefully equipped our listeners with the knowledge to protect themselves. A huge thank you to you for guiding us through this.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah,
Remember, knowledge is power.
absolutely. To our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and if something seems too good to be true, it probably is.